Namaskar and good evening. Let me at the very outset thank the ORF for inviting me to deliver the valedictory address on India's G20 presidency and the Global South. As this is the last session of the Raisina process, I want to felicitate Samir and his team for an outstanding conference yet again. And as I told Samir as we were entering, the competition only lies in between the Raisinas that he's hosted, from the first to the second to the fifth to the sixth that we have now. But it's been really, I think, very, very interesting and most stimulating sessions that we have seen, excellent conversations, and I think we have a lot to take home with us as we go our respective ways. I was also benefited from some of the conversations that just took place before I came up on the stage. I want to congratulate Ambassador Jhanvi Tripathi of the UN, Professor Sachin Chaturvedi, my colleague Inam Gambhir, and all of you who have contributed and whose views are so important to our presidency. Now, just yesterday actually, I was in Hyderabad. We had the G20's Global Partnership for Financial Inclusion. And this is one of the G20 initiatives that really involves countries which are beyond the G20. The whole idea being to move, from a cash-based system to more digital-based transactions. And as part of that process, yesterday, under our presidency, we invited some 40 developing and emerging country representatives with our partner, the UN's Better Than Cash Alliance. The objective was to really work with our partners in achieving digital transformation that we want to do. It is part of our presidency, but the success lies in working with our partners across the globe. So working with our friends from the Global South, consulting them, and trying to see where their views fit in is, I think, very, very important in our presidency. But just to place things in context, this is the 4th month of our presidency. In the last 3 months, we have hosted some 35 meetings in 26 different locations across our country. That itself is a record of sorts, because I think no G20 presidency has hosted meetings in as many geographies as we have. The whole point behind it, of course, was to ensure that we take the G20 from being a remote event in Delhi to bringing it close to people in all of our states and all of our different parts of our very, very vast country. So the objective is to make every state, via federal government, and every citizen a stakeholder and a partner in the G20 presidency's process. And I think we are in the midst of really achieving that objective. To really dwell on the subject that we have today, which is G20 presidency and the Global South, we need to place in perspective India's perspective, the time that it comes in and the circumstances in which we are resuming the presidency. Of course, much of your discussions over the last few days, especially today, would have been on these topics. So I'll just briefly, of course, highlight what we already know. You've had both the COVID-19 pandemic followed by the Ukraine conflict, which has had its very, very significant impact on, adverse impact on global growth, inflation, and many of us mentioned the SDGs, and yes, the SDGs have been impacted very adversely. But it is the Global South that has really faced the brunt of these major black swan events, if I may call them that. It's, in many senses, lowered growth, high costs of import of fuel, food, fertilizers, lowering remittances, decreased demand for goods and services have really put a lot of our developing countries into a state of indebtedness. And that also came up in the conversation earlier today. The IMF's managing director, Kristalina Georgieva, mentioned a few days ago when she was here for the finance ministers and central bank governors meeting. She said there are 349 million people in 79 countries who are facing acute food security issues. She also said that 60% of low-income countries are either debt distressed or in high risk of being debt distressed. Of course, on a certain, if you look at it from a silver lining perspective, 4/5 of total global growth this year will come from emerging and developing economies. India alone will contribute 15% of that growth. So if you look at it from India's perspective, when we take over the presidency, what is the context that we take it over? We believe that we have, at a comparative level, tackled the devastation caused by the COVID crisis reasonably well. We have emerged as a resilient economy. We are also today the fastest growing large economy in the world at 6.5 to 7%. The next 25 years for us are very important because this is the 25 years that will take us to our 100th anniversary. And we do believe that this period is critical in our being able to achieve our stated objective of becoming a developed country by 2047. So from our context, of course, people mention demographics, young population, high growth rate, high aspirations, and all of that is there. But India has always, we do believe that it's important to grow, but we must grow with our partners, with our friends. And I think in that endeavor, India has always worked with the developing world, with the global south, traditionally. In the last 10 years, of course, this effort has been even more pronounced. We have invested some $25 billion in development assistance in the last decade or so. It's a 35% increase over the previous 10 years. From that perspective, I think our efforts to work on developing or work on partnering our developing country partners has grown. And if you look at that from that point of view, I think the partnership that we intend to achieve with the Global South is important. During the COVID crisis, we provided pharmaceutical support. We provided vaccines under our Vaccine Maitri program to about 160 countries across the globe. So our endeavor has always been that we work with others, we work for the global common good, what our Prime Minister refers to as human-centric globalization. Recently, that's in the month of January, we took the initiative to consult our friends in the Global South, what we call the Voice of Global South Summit. And that opportunity provided us to interface with 125 developing countries across the world. At that time, the Prime Minister mentioned to the leaders that he spoke to, he said, your priorities are India's priorities, and your voice is India's voice. In other words, wherever we are in the lead, whether it's the G20 or it is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, earlier in the UN Security Council, we will articulate the aspirations, the interests, the hopes, and the views of the developing world. And Dr. Jaishankar, our External Affairs Minister, also said that India is perceived to be the voice of the Global South. So from that context, I think we've got in this interaction under the Voice of Global South a good idea about what our developing country partners want us to take up, want us to try and achieve. And if you look at our broad priorities under our presidency, whether it is trying to foster accelerated, sustainable, inclusive growth, whether it is working on ensuring that the faltering momentum of the SDGs is restored, whether it is working on ensuring digital transformations, using our experience and our expertise with the digital transformation process, leveraging technologies for public health, using this for financial inclusion, whether it is trying to ensure a green development compact in terms of lifestyle for environment, ensuring that we are not just talking about climate action, but our own individual actions are important, and therefore sustainable consumption and sustainable production, which many of you who are steeped in the SDGs would know that it is SDG 12, This is an area also that we have to focus on. So lifestyle for environment is important. The head of the UN in India is here, and he would recall that when the UN Secretary General visited India, he strongly endorsed the concept of lifestyle for environment, but he also said, that the world is living at 1.6 times that the earth can sustain. In other words, we are living lives that are unsustainable, and we have to do something about it. And our effort is to raise the consciousness levels of this need for following a circular economy, for many steps that are outlined in many of the efforts that we're making through our environment working group and other efforts in the G20. Now, multilateral reform is important because the issue of indebtedness is there. How can we work with the multilateral financial institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions, in enhancing their mandate to enable them to deliver on the requirements of the 21st century? In other words, how can we access more private sector financing, blended financing? How can the MFIs contribute to climate technology and climate financing? How can they alleviate the concerns of the large numbers of developing countries that are in debt? So we are working with the multilateral financial institutions, with our partners in the G20 to look at how we can reform multilateral institutions to bring them into a level that can actually increasingly contribute to the current economic situation. And of course, women-led development, I think there was a reference to that in the earlier conversations. I think that is something that we're trying to mainstream into all of our working groups and engagement groups, and will become a very important mainstay under our presidency. So our priorities are not just the G20's priorities, our priorities are the priorities of the Global South. And I think as we go along, we will see how these priorities impact on the way that we conduct ourselves under our presidency. Now, as I mentioned, in the 3 months that we've had our presidency, we've had a number of meetings, but we've also had 2 ministerial meetings. We've had the meeting of finance ministers and central bank governors in Bengaluru. And just last week, earlier this week, we had the meeting of the foreign ministers of the G20. And I think we have worked on a number of issues. I mean, of course, the finance ministers and foreign ministers deal with very different issues. And we've seen that there is a broad level of convergence across the G20 on the issues that are important to us. We do understand that geopolitical polarizations cut across the G20. But our endeavor has been to say that, look, there is a larger reality out there. There are expectations of us in the G20 that we need to be able to deliver on what are very, very pressing issues of the day. And we must, when it comes to that, work together and deliver together. And as we all know, the G20 works on consensus. Without consensus, you cannot achieve the results that you want to do. But at the same time, because it works on consensus, because the G20 is such a representative body, geographically, but also ideologically, that its decisions really, once made, are very, very easily implemented. So our effort is to work on that. Now, in the finance ministers meeting, I think there was some positive movement on issues that are important. I think there was some broad convergence on language which related to debt resolution for the Global South. This is an important issue when it comes to this topic. So I think we are really working with our partners in the G20 to look at how we can address the issue of indebtedness, and we are getting somewhere. There was also a very broad understanding that digital public infrastructure, major investments in digital public infrastructure can contribute greatly to countries meeting their national objectives. And this is important because not all countries are on board, but getting countries on board to come on the same page on this, I think, was an important objective. And also, we were able to share with delegates across the board information on how digital public infrastructure can meet the needs of individuals, whether it comes to social security, financial inclusion, health insurance, digital transactions, getting access to credit financial inclusion is an important part of that, and the DPIs, digital public infrastructure, is critical to that effort. At the Bali summit, some of you would have noted that our Prime Minister mentioned, he said that there are 4 billion people today who don't have identities. In other words, they don't have identity cards, and they don't have the ability to prove who they are. There are also 2 billion people globally who don't have access to bank accounts. They are unbankable. In India, we had a very major effort to bring everybody into the banking sector, what we call banking the unbankable. And that has enabled us to put money directly into accounts of beneficiaries, what we call direct benefits transfers. And I think this has worked in achieving financial inclusion in a manner that has been unparalleled in many senses. And beneficiaries have been, of course, not only the most vulnerable sections of our population, but the majority of beneficiaries have been women. In rural areas, 67% of beneficiaries have been women. But overall, close to 60% of beneficiaries under these schemes of direct benefits transfers, opening accounts, new accounts, have been women. And I think that has empowered women in many senses. And this is something that we're working within the G20. There were also questions on interoperability. I mean, I think a lot of delegates looked very carefully at India's agreement with Singapore to tie up our unified payments interface, UPI system, with Singapore's Pay Now system, which basically these synergies enabled these systems to work in a very, very smooth manner and makes it easy for people who travel in each other's countries. So that was an important aspect there also. And of course, there was an understanding that investing in digital public infrastructure in the long run can create a lot of benefits for governments and people who are beneficiaries. So our effort, of course, through the global partnership on financial inclusion, through involving our partners from the Global South, was to see how we can use our experience, our know-how, to benefit countries, to empower their citizens across the globe. Again, the Prime Minister encouraged the finance ministers to work on the most vulnerable sections of our people all over the world. And the effort has been to look at how we can use financial inclusion to really benefit the developing world. So this is a tangible that we can easily take across. It is as tangible as using a digital platform to administer vaccines, or to have a public health portal, or to deal with, as I said, direct benefits transfers. And there are applications across the board that can help the most vulnerable citizens of the world. So in all of this, the essential thing, and I wind down what is, I'm sure, a very, very long program, is to say that as far as our presidency is concerned, our theme of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, one earth, one family, one future, is how we intend to conduct our presidency, work for the global common good. And in this, the Global South is especially, I think, important from our presidency's point of view. And I'm so glad that many of you who are from the Global South spoke out today. And I think we are greatly privileged to have you in Delhi at a time when we are conducting our own presidency. So thank you very much.